Greetings once more, comrade. We'll be starting just in a minute. Thanks for patience. Just sorting out the necessary technologies so that they're in order. Revolutionary greetings, comrades. Many thanks to all of you for joining us in this important conversation on the necessity to rebuild revolutionary Pan-Africanism in the fight for a true liberation. The African continent continues to be a playground for imperialism and capitalism. The rich mineral wealth and other strategic resources in the continent are not used for the development of the people. To the contrary, they are used for the underdevelopment. We are defined by extreme levels of poverty and backwardness. We have weak state institutions, unable to provide decent education, healthcare, and necessary infrastructure to help lift millions of the masses out of poverty and misery. We have seen how all over the world, at least last year onwards, from Sudan to Lebanon, Ecuador, and now most recently in the United States of America, the rise in the energies of the working class to resist the oppressive and exploitative conditions they are subjected to under fascist, capitalist, and brutal regimes which are the enemies of the people. In fact, Kwame Nkrumah once said that the great millions of Africa, Asia, to that list you can add South America, the United States of America, and the world over, have now grown impatient with being hewers of wood and drawers of water, and are rebelling against the false belief that Providence created some to be menials of others. To help us unpack today's subject matter on the need to rebuild revolutionary Pan-Africanism in the fight for true liberation, we are joined by Comrade Kwesi Pratt Jr. Comrade Kwesi is the managing director of the Inside newspaper and is a member of the national leadership of the Socialist Forum of Ghana. Generally, he has dedicated most of his life and channeled his energies in expanding the struggle for revolutionary Pan-Africanism and socialism. He was one of the key organizers of the Pan-Africanism Today conference, which was held in Winneba, Ghana in September 2018, which myself was also part of that conference. And it was a very successful and well-organized conference where progressive forces from social movements, trade unions, and other socialist formations across the continent came together to craft a revolutionary Pan-Africanist program in order to unite our struggles. With this introduction having been made, the order of our session will be as follows. Comrade Kwesi is going to unpack the ongoing struggle for African liberation for 40 to 45 minutes. Then afterwards, we'll have question and answers from you comrades joining us to between 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll be in that process collecting questions from yourself. Feel free to put your questions on the Facebook platform, but also here on the Zoom platform. And then we'll raise those questions with Comrade Kwesi. With that being said, Comrade Kwesi, it's now over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, comrades, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for this opportunity for us to have a conversation around the issues of revolutionary Pan-Africanism. I'm hoping that at the end of this session, I will be able to learn a few things, add to the knowledge that we have, and so on. I'm hoping to learn from all of us as we engage in this conversation. I think first and foremost, it is important to start with definitions. And these definitions are absolutely important because Pan-Africanism means differently from organization to organization, sometimes from person to person, and so on. And it's important that we settle on what we think is Pan-Africanism. The term revolutionary Pan-Africanism doesn't quite answer the fundamental questions. Because we do know of the cultural nationalists, both on the continent and in the diaspora, who also consider themselves revolutionary and who claim to believe in Pan-Africanism and actually to be working for Pan-Africanism. So it's important to make these distinctions. As far as I'm concerned, the most concrete definition of Pan-Africanism can be found in the final resolution of the 5th Pan-Africanist Congress in Manchester in the United Kingdom. This final resolution recognizes the need to intensify the anti-colonial struggle, but the need to intensify the anti-colonial struggle under the banner of socialism. So that's very clear. By 1945, the Manchester Congress decided that Pan-Africanism must also be socialist, and that you cannot have Pan-Africanism which is not socialist, and so on. Now, it is important to recognize that the struggle against colonialism was a struggle against a variant of capitalism. Colonialism essentially is a variation of capitalism. And so is the struggle against neocolonialism. And we cannot uproot completely the vestiges of colonialism and neocolonialism without combating the capitalist system and replacing it with something which is owned, which is built, and so on, by the working class and its allies. And that clearly, it's socialism. Now, it's important also to recognize that after the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, various groups sprang up on the continent to pursue the agenda, the anti-colonialist agenda. And these groups did not work within nation states. They worked across the boundaries and so on. One of the most typical of these groups was the West African Students' Union, which had leaders from Nigeria, leaders from Ghana, leaders from Sierra Leone, and so on, working together to liberate all of West Africa from the yoke of colonialism and to form the basis for building a united Africa in which our economic systems, our social systems, and political systems were fully integrated. Now, I think it's important also for us to recognize that when we struggled against colonialism, we were struggling for the rights of the African people and the colonized people everywhere to make their own political decisions, to make their own political choices, and so on. We were also struggling for control of our resources, of all of our resources, the resources that are embedded in the earth and the resources above the earth. We're struggling to be able to make decisions about how these resources should be exploited, for whose benefit these resources should be exploited, and what these resources needed to be spent on. Indeed, it's significant to note that 60 years after independence of some countries in Africa and so on, the African people have still not been able to own their resources and to exploit these resources for their benefit. I mean, if you take a country like Ghana, currently, the people of Ghana through the state own only about 3% of the gold resources. Their interest in the gold resources amounts to only about 3%. If you're looking at the revenue which is generated from the export of gold and so on, Ghana gets less than 2% of the total revenue and so on. If you take oil and gas, Ghana's total stake in its oil and gas is 13.5%. And we can go on and on about diamonds and all, and the story is simply the same. So we've not even been able to achieve the objectives that we set up for ourselves in the struggle against classical colonialism. Because these resources do not belong to us, they are not exploited by us, and they are not exploited for the benefit of our people and so on. So that's one of the key areas of struggle. That's one of the key areas we need to look at in pushing the agenda of Pan-Africanism, how to complete the struggle against colonialism and to achieve the objectives we set ourselves in that struggle. Now, there's a phenomena everywhere in Africa which has simply been described as the race to the bottom. And this is a very interesting phenomena that we need to look at. African countries, as we all do know, have been divided into small units. They were divided at the Berlin Conference. They were divided at the instance of the imperialist powers. That division did not take into account the social, political, cultural needs of the African people. The imperialist powers just drew lines across the continent and created these so-called nations and so on. And this has also enabled us today to exercise maximum control over the African people by playing one country against the other. You know, when it comes to negotiating for access to the resources of Africa, that is where this phenomenon of the race to the bottom comes out. Anglo Ashanti goes to Guinea and tells the Guinean government that, look, we've just had a negotiation with the government of Ghana. They have given us 2 years tax holiday. If we can do better, then we can move our investments from Ghana to Guinea, because capital goes where it can yield a lot of profit and so on. The Guineans look at the situation, they are interested in attracting Anglo Ashanti and so on. And they say, well, instead of 2 years tax holiday, we're going to give you 3 years. They then move to La Côte d'Ivoire and tell La Côte d'Ivoire, well, we went to Ghana, they gave us 2 years tax holiday. We've gone to Guinea, Guinea has given us 3 years tax holiday. You have to do better than Guinea so that you can get our investment. And then the Ivorians decide to give them 5 years tax holiday and so on. So we are racing to the bottom. This unhelpful and necessary competition amongst African countries is pushing us to the bottom. And it becomes important for us to find ways to develop mechanisms where we shall be able to deal with the forces of imperialism and neocolonialism together, so that we can get better terms than the current situation in which we are simply just racing to the bottom. And it happens with all the institutions and so on. Indeed, if you follow very closely, the so-called G7 meetings annually and so on, you'll find that the same thing happens. And before the G7 meets the African leaders and so on, they consult a lot, they work together and so on. And then they invite the African countries to individually go there and negotiate with them. So we are negotiating as Ghana, we are negotiating as Nigeria, we are negotiating as Togo, and they are negotiating as the G7. We don't appear to have, enough room to be able and enough strength to be able to make demands that are in the best interest of our people and so on. Of course, added to this is also the question of foreign military bases on the continent of Africa. The foreign military bases of the continent of Africa have added to strengthening the forces of imperialism and also strengthening the negative forces of reaction and counter-revolution. Indeed, in 2001, the Bush administration set up what became known as the Cheney Committee. And the Cheney Committee was led by Dick Cheney, who was then Secretary of State. The Cheney Committee then was asked to look at the USA's energy requirements for about 10 years and to make recommendations. The Cheney report, which is available on the net, anybody can have the Cheney report, actually recommended that the US pay special attention to West Africa because of the hydrocarbon assets of West Africa. And because it was getting increasingly difficult for them to exploit energy resources in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, and that it was important to turn their attention to West Africa. The Cheney report then went further to state that if need be, the United States needed to establish military bases across West Africa in order for the US to push its agenda of controlling the resources that were growing in West Africa and so on. Now, many things have happened since then, which confirm that the Cheney report was taken seriously by the US administration. In Ghana, we have signed an agreement with the US which enables the US to establish a military base in Ghana. Indeed, the military base has become operational in Ghana. The conditions and so on that we have agreed to will be shocking to many people. For example, we have agreed that when US troops commit crimes in Ghana, they should not be subject to the laws of Ghana. They cannot be tried in Ghana. We've also agreed that if Ghanaians are killed by US forces, the Ghanaian families and so on cannot go to court. They cannot ask for compensation. We've given them our airport. We have 3 terminals in Accra. One of the terminals has been completely dedicated for the use of the US armed forces and so on. They use our spectrum for free without paying a peso to Ghana. They come into Ghana without customs examination and they leave Ghana without customs examination and so on. I mean, clearly enforcing the neo-colonial stature of Ghana, the neo-colonial position of Ghana and so on. But these military bases are not just there to wage war or to collaborate with reactionary forces and so on. They are there purely for an economic reason. They are there to control the economies of African countries. It is not just the US. We do know about French military forces, their presence in Chad. We do know of their presence in Niger. We do know of their collaboration with the Togolese authorities. We do know of their presence in La Côte d'Ivoire, where they actually assisted rebel forces to overthrow the nationalist government of Laurent Gbagbo and so on. So the issue of military bases, the establishment of foreign military bases, Western military bases in Africa, is an important area that we need to look at if indeed we are revolutionary Pan-Africanists who have clear intent about mobilizing the masses of our people in struggle, which would enable us, first of all, to build a just society, to control our own resources, to make our own political decisions, and to build our own social and economic infrastructure. That's one area that we need to look at. It also becomes very, very important for us to look at how we can develop and promote popular culture in Africa. You know, earlier on, I've spoken about some of our brothers and sisters who insist that Pan-Africanism is about the unity of Africans, but the unity of Africans based solely on our history, that we need to go back to the era of the chiefs. We need to use the chieftaincy institution as our model. We need to wear the clothes that our ancestors were wearing, and we need to do all the things that our ancestors were doing. We need to carry our leaders in palanquins and so on. Now, these elements, these cultural nationalists and so on, they appear to have quite a following across Africa. In fact, there are groups which are Pan-African in essence, like Imoja and others, who preach this kind of thing, and they exist in our universities and so on. And for them, the capitalist ideology and socialist ideology and so on are European constructs, and that they need to be rejected by the African people if we are to move forward and so on. This cultural aberration and so on is something that we need to pay attention to. What alternative do we present? What popular culture would we encourage? What should be the content of that popular culture? And how will that popular culture's development be directly related to the struggles of the working people of Africa and their allies? Is an area that we may want to look at. It is also important to recognize that xenophobia is a growing phenomenon on the African continent. I mean, recently, we saw what happened in South Africa, to which our South African comrades can speak more eloquently than we can do. But we saw what happened in South Africa. And we saw its repercussions in other parts, of Africa. I mean, Nigeria, where our brothers and sisters in Nigeria decided to bend down any and everything South African as revenge and so on. Now, we need to examine xenophobia, its origins, and so on. Based on the little that we know about South Africa, of course, the comrades there do know far more better than we do in Ghana. But based on our understanding of the problem of xenophobia in South Africa, it's an apartheid legacy. You understand? Under apartheid, everything African was denigrated. Under apartheid, South Africans were made to feel that Africans on the continent were inferior, and so on. They were made to feel that white power was everything, and so on. So there's a certain psychological, psychological situation which was created, which has not quite been tackled vigorously after the defeat, the partial defeat of apartheid. That is part of it. The other part of it is that the working masses, do not somehow recognize that indeed their plight today, joblessness, unemployment, hunger, disease, lack of access to social services and so on, are all direct results of the imposition of a capitalist system by the ruling elite and so on. It may also be a reflection generally of the levels of the development of consciousness in our different countries and so on. Whatever the reasons may be, it presents a huge problem to those who want to pursue revolutionary Pan-Africanism on the continent. And it's important that we find a way of dealing with these issues. And I'm sure that in the conversations that will continue, we will all look at the issue of xenophobia and its consequences for the development and promotion of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, and we'll have a thing or two, to say about that. Then there's the issue, the gender question. And I think that the gender question is a very, very important issue for Pan-Africanists everywhere. It ought to be a very, very important issue. There's no doubt that African societies have been, they've been male-dominated for years. I mean, in Ghana, many of the ethnic groups in Ghana and so on, their chieftaincy system does not allow women to become leaders. Of course, it discriminates against albinos and so on, but there's a special discrimination against women. Women are not allowed into leadership and so on. Now, if you come to consider the statistics, just from the point of view of common sense alone, you understand, and you realize that more than 50% of the African population is made up of women and so on. It simply does not make sense to deny 50% of the population a part in the process of development, a part in the process of generating resources to resolve the various problems that confront us. Common sense alone makes it imperative for the involvement of women in the processes of production, in leadership, and so on, so that we can move towards, the attainment of our goals. But more importantly, I mean, socialism is about the rights of human beings. Socialism is about the rights of all human beings, irrespective of their sexual orientation and so on. And women, like men, like children, and so on, ought to be able to defend and protect their rights. It's the duty of every socialist to join in that struggle to liberate women from exploitation and oppression based on outmoded concepts, outmoded views of society, and so on. So the gender question is a very, very important question that we should incorporate into the definition of what Pan-Africanism is or is not. I think it's also extremely important to place special emphasis on the rights of workers, because the rights of workers have eroded over the years, I mean, significant gains were made in the struggle to emancipate workers, the struggle to liberate workers from arduous labor, to liberate workers, from the slave conditions of their existence and so on. But we have suffered significant reversals since we embarked on the path of neoliberalism in the early 1980s. In the early 1980s, under the marching orders of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, we embarked upon economic recovery programs, which had many aspects. One of the aspects, for example, was the retrenchment of labor in the public service and in the civil services. In Ghana, in 1983 alone, as many as 300,000 workers lost their jobs. It also went along with the policy of withdrawing subsidies on social services like health and education and so on. And indeed, workers were so hard hit by this reckless policy. The other policy instrument had to do with the unbridled privatization of state enterprises, which accentuated the job losses, which took away huge revenue from the state, and which virtually led to a privatization of all services, including social services and so on. It also came along with a massive devaluation of national currencies. And of course, the consequences, hit workers far more than any segment of the society. In Ghana, for example, the Industrial Relations Act of 1965, which is promulgated by the Nkrumah government, has been reviewed. And in the review, the Ghana government has actually banned solidarity strikes. So solidarity strikes are not allowed in Ghana anymore. Of course, I'm sure that all of us know what solidarity strikes are, given the fact that my comrades from NUMSA, some comrades from NUMSA on this panel, it may not be necessary to explain what solidarity strikes are. But in addition to that, in addition to abolishing solidarity strikes, we have also, come up with legislation which has cancelled the check-off system. And the check-off system is simply the system where union members get their dues deducted at source and paid to the trade union movement. Now you have a situation where every worker, has to take his own contribution to the trade union movement and so on. And this is clearly a measure which is aimed at ensuring that the trade union movement is weakened financially, is not able to mobilize enough resources to be able to carry out, its work. Now, before the February 24, 1966 coup in Ghana, there was the Trades Union Congress, which had 17 affiliates. And so the trade union movement was united, they worked together under one umbrella and so on. With the review of the Industrial Relations Act and so on, now we have a situation where there are indeed close to 100 trade union movements in Ghana. And the Trades Union Congress of Ghana is no longer the umbrella body. So it has led to a splintering of the labor front. And that is exceedingly worrisome. This is not just limited to Ghana. It's happened in many other African countries. It's happened in Nigeria. It's happened in many other African countries. And it's important for us to look at that. Now we also have a situation where in different workplaces, you can go to one workplace and find 10 different trade unions existing in the same place. You understand? We have also begun to unionize managers and so on. So you go to a place and the managers have their own union and so on. They have been given a collective bargaining certificate and so on. So the fragmentation of the workers' front is also something that we need to look at, quite seriously. Then I think it's important also to pay some serious attention to the youth and students movement. Not too long ago, we did have the International Union of Students and the World Federation of Democratic Youth. We did have, for example, the All African Students Union and other such bodies across the continent and across the globe, which served as the front for the mass mobilization of youth and students along progressive lines, along lines that rejected neocolonialism, that rejected colonialism, and that rejected imperialist impositions and so on. Many of these organizations, even if they exist, are a pale shadow of themselves. And perhaps we need to find ways of bringing together young people, youth and students into movements, beyond national boundaries and so on, and to see how best they can be mobilized, to confront the common enemy. In this struggle, I do think that it may become necessary to build broad fronts. In addition to having revolutionary Pan-Africanist organizations across the continent and in the diaspora and everywhere where it's possible, it may become necessary to build broad fronts on specific issues. It is, for example, possible to unite the trade unions, the landless movement, the Peasant and Farmers Association, some human rights organizations, and anti-corruption movements on broad fronts to be able to wage this battle against decadence on our continent, against capitalism, and against all the manifestations of imperialism. If you're going to build broad fronts and succeed, then the question of the development of minimum programs is going to be relevant here. What program can we develop which would enable us to work with the trade unions, which may not necessarily be revolutionary? What platform can we build which may enable us to work with landless movements, which may not necessarily be revolutionary? What is the common thing that will unite us and anti-corruption organizations across Africa and so on? So we need to think about the question of broad fronts, much more seriously than perhaps we have done in the past. What is it that we can do, to promote the broad front and so on? Now, having said all of this, I think it's also important for us to pay particular attention to how to popularize our ideas, to pay particular attention to how to incorporate the needs, aspirations, and so on of working people into the broader framework for struggle and so on. And here, I think the issue of popular education comes up very, very strongly. Popular education, popular education. How do we organize popular education across the continent? I'm already aware of the fact that some efforts are being done. A notable example is the Nkrumah School in South Africa, which has brought together media practitioners, activists, and so on from across the continent and beyond. I'm keenly aware of what is happening at the America Cabral School in Ghana, and so on. But I think that we still need to reflect, a lot more and to answer some very pertinent questions today. Now, I've been to some of these schools and so on, and if you go to these schools, you are left in no doubt at all that you are dealing with people like me, you are dealing with people who have some education, who can read and write. But come to think of it, on the continent of Africa, there's a huge body of people who cannot read and write.
Absolutely.
A huge body of underprivileged people who do not speak English. Huge body of underprivileged people who have never stepped into a classroom. Those are the flowers of the revolution for now and the future. How do we take popular education to the vast body of uneducated people, to the vast body of people who do not speak English, the vast majority of our people who are not able to read the text that we read and so on? That's a challenge which confronts all of us, and we need to look at that very seriously. In Ghana, we have started what we call the mini national schools. And as a response to COVID-19 and so on, what we are doing basically is to bringing together activists and of not more than 15 people at a time, and taking them through the classics, taking them through history of Africa and all of that and so on. Now, we've organized 4 of such schools already. I mean, since we started, we intend to organize about 40 of those schools by the end of the year and so on. What we are increasingly beginning to realize is that special people need special communications. And it emphasizes the need to look at the concept of popular education and how we may be able to reach communities, to reach identifiable groups that we are unable to reach because of their peculiar circumstances. This is a challenge to us, it's a challenge to the Pan-African movement, and it's a challenge to all who aspire for change in Africa and change, in the world. Now, currently, we have very peculiar circumstances. We are living in extraordinary times. We are living in the era of COVID-19. And COVID-19 has exposed all the fault lines in our societies and so on. One of the things that COVID-19 has exposed vividly is the level of poverty and deprivation, not just on the continent of Africa, but everywhere in the world. COVID-19 has also exposed all the lies about the strength of the capitalist economy. In Ghana, for example, it has shown very clearly that in the face of the pandemic, we are unable to mobilize sufficient resources to look after the medical needs of our people and so on. And we've had to run to the IMF and the World Bank, for assistance. It has shown the fragility of the system that we run and so on. It has increasingly made the population aware that the usual statistics which are thrown at us can sometimes or most times or all times be absolutely meaningless. This whole thing about the gross domestic product, the gross national product, the per capita income, the rate of inflation and so on. All of these statistical averages do not tell the true story of the African people. And all of this have been exposed by the onset of COVID-19. So we need to learn the important lessons that COVID-19 presents to us, and we need to recognize that COVID-19.
Oh, sorry. Seems like we've lost Comrade Kwesi a bit there, but let's see if it reconnects again. Let's see if it reconnects. Sorry for that glitch. Sure, he's reconnecting. Comrade Kwesi? Sorry for that glitch, comrade. He was still, especially, it's very important what he was raising, especially given the challenges of the COVID-19 moment and how it exposes the fault lines within the capitalist system. In fact, the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production have been raised sharply at this particular moment in time. But I'm sure Comrade Kwesi is trying to reconnect and was going to be wrapping up his discussion so that we're able to take questions. And comrades, let's just remind you, if you have any burning questions, inputs in terms of the conversation, please feel free. There's a Facebook platform where you can actually put those concerns, but also in this platform here on the Zoom, you can also put that. So please don't hesitate to make the conversation richer, but also raise fundamental questions that we have to be thinking about, because obviously COVID-19 is here. The moment of the lockdowns, as we are seeing, they are starting to ease down. The struggle continues. It's a luta continua. What should be the path for the working class going forward? Because the energies and everything else that we've seen, Comrade Kwesi was reflecting just now, for instance, some of the fault lines are the fact that poverty levels have been clearly exposed, levels of backwardness in the continent, unemployment, and so forth. And also, partly because we're talking about COVID-19, our healthcare institutions themselves have been largely exposed. You know, the healthcare institutions, they are weak. In the introduction, we raised the question that we have weak state institutions. That means that the large masses of our people, particularly because health itself is a commodity in a capitalist system, the ones who are in masses, they don't have money, they cannot pay for this health, they are rejected. So we have to think, but also as we're having this conversation, there are talks about developing a possible vaccine and things like that. So in a context of capitalism, how do we think about things like that? So it's very important, I think, this conversation, but we're still trying to see if Comrade Kwesa reconnects with, we've lost him due to, it could be a technological glitch or a connection problem, but we're hoping that he can join us soon. Thank you for staying on, comrades, and continuing to listen to us. We'll have him back on very soon. Comrade Kwesa, are you back with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay. We're still trying to connect, comrade. But hopefully, Comrade Kwesa will join us.
Back now. I hope
you back, Comrade Kwesa? Okay, thank you. You were still going on, perhaps just in the next 5 minutes as we are wrapping up, so that we're able to take questions and clarities from comrades.
Well, look, I think that the building of a revolutionary Pan-Africanist movement is an imperative. We have no choice. That's the only way forward, for us. Now, if you read Nkrumah's book, Africa Must Unite, Nkrumah makes the point that Africa has more than 50% of the world's resources, human beings, rivers, mineral wealth, and so on. And he does the calculation. And yet, our people happen to be so very poor. The level of poverty on the African continent is inexcusable. The level of deprivation and so on the African continent is simply, inexplicable. It's explicable, but we cannot tolerate that. And clearly, the building of revolutionary Pan-Africanism on the continent is the only way out for us. And it becomes imperative for us to work hard to build a new Africa in which no child will go to bed on an empty stomach. It's imperative for us in Africa to build that new Africa, which will hold its own against any force in the world. To build that new Africa, which is not isolated from the rest of the world, which is deeply integrated into the rest of the world, but on the side of justice, equality, and a non-exploitative global society. I think perhaps the interactions will be more important than me sitting here and ranting. And therefore, I'd like to end here so that we can have a lot more time for interactions.
Thank you very much, Comrade Kwesa, for that. I think it's very rich and clear. I like the fact that you brought in the history, because obviously there will be variants in terms of Pan-Africanism, so we needed clarity. But also you brought to the fore quite sharply, the different axes of struggle when it comes to this particular question, varying from the struggles that the women are experiencing, but also in terms of the youth, the trade unions, and also many other forces. So perhaps before I check with the comrades in our platforms in terms of the question, I just want to ask comrades, because, for instance, the African Union today, it tends to, there's an agenda that it calls Agenda 2063, which it is touting to be some kind of a socialist or social transformation kind of a blueprint, which is pursuing. In that line, sometimes even at the time when Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who's a minister here in South Africa, was a chair, she was even writing a letter from 2063 from the future, writing to Kwame Nkrumah, saying that with this Agenda 2063, which is supposed to be a social transformation, they are envisioning it for the continent. They are saying that it will rid us of all the ills that we are faced with. I just want to hear from you as to what is your analysis when it comes to this particular Agenda 2063, especially when they can tout it around, making people to believe that it is actually the right blueprint, let alone the fact that they are delaying such a thing to 43 years from now.
I think it should be clear to us that the African Union is a club of our neo-colonial leaders. That is what the African Union is. The African Union is a club of all these leaders who have embarked on the pursuit of the neoliberal agenda. These are not the leaders who represent the working class in Africa. These are not the leaders who are interested in delinking the continent of Africa and its diaspora from the colonial metropolis. These are not the type of leaders who are interested in building a viable, independent Africa, which is able to stand on its own, exploit its resources, and use the resources in order to resolve the concrete problems that confront the working people and their allies. You understand? Agenda 2063 is essentially the agenda of the ruling elite in Africa. And we should not deceive ourselves at all about it. You know, look, from the beginning, I did make the point that there are various forces who believe in African unity. There are people who believe in African unity. They are passionate about it. They really want African unity, but they want African unity as an appendage of the capitalist world. That is not the African unity that we want and need to struggle for. We need to struggle for a united Africa, which is completely delinked from the colonial metropolis. We need to struggle for a united Africa which pursues the policy of self-reliance, collective self-reliance of the African people. We need to pursue the building of a Pan-African movement, a Pan-African society, which aims, you know, at ensuring that we build a situation in which each receives according to their need and each gives according to their ability. That should be our objective, not Agenda 2063.
Thank you so much, Comrade, for that clarity. Perhaps let me just share with you a couple of questions that are coming in from the comrades who are checking us on the Facebook and things like that. You spoke about popular education, which I think is very important. Its a role is very fundamental. What perhaps concrete examples from the history that are there that we can learn from, where popular education has been taken to the masses? That's partly one. And also one other comrade was checking to say, what could be the role of the comrades in the diaspora, making sure that they join in and being part of this much needed movement that has work cut out to revive and also to rebuild revolutionary Pan-Africanism?
Well, I think we should see literacy as an important component of popular education. It's been tried in Cuba, it's been tried in other countries and so on, where emphasis has been placed on making it possible for all persons, you know, to be able to read and write. So literacy as an important component of popular education is key, especially when we want to go beyond our current boundaries and to involve people who are not literate, who have not had formal training in the kinds of schools that we have and so on. The promotion of literacy becomes very, very important, you know. As for the diaspora, I think it's important also to recognize that the diaspora is not uniform, it's not monolithic. Colin Powell was certainly an African or a person of African descent. Condoleezza Rice was certainly a person of African descent. But we should be asking ourselves where they stand, you know, in the scheme of things when it comes to the struggle of the African people against oppression and against exploitation. You understand? So yes, there's a diaspora, but that diaspora is made up of revolutionaries and is made up of counter-revolutionaries as well. And our emphasis should not be on the general mobilization of the African diaspora because they are simply the African diaspora. Our emphasis ought to be on the revolutionary African diaspora rather than just the African diaspora. Because all of the problems that we have, a lot of that has also come from the diaspora. You know, the organizations in the diaspora, for example, which are advocates of neoliberalism, the organizations in the diaspora which accept our current neo-colonial state as the only possibility available to us and so on. So the African diaspora is important. It's important to mobilize and so on, but we must be very, very clear what we are mobilizing for and what we are mobilizing.
Thank you, Comrade Kosi. I'm trying to check if the comrades might have any additional questions, but um, in the absence of that, I think you've raised this moment for me and for many comrades. It should be an awakening moment because you've clearly raised that it has exposed clearly the fault lines, and therefore after this particular era, even as we see that the lockdowns are easing down, we cannot go back to we can't allow the normal that existed before this to continue. We'll have to dedicate our energy seriously to make sure that we pursue the line that you've raised, the revolutionary Pan-Africanism. Otherwise, the problems which are here are going to continue. And I'm sure even the capitalist grouping, they are definitely even plotting as we are going to be exiting these moments, how to intensify things because they know that the hopes of the people are going to be increasing. So we definitely have a work cut out for ourselves in that line. I don't know if there's any perhaps or there's okay there's some okay you can talk over it. I'll give you a point just now. Someone is
there are
raising
forces
something.
in Africa and beyond Africa which are working actively to return us to the old normal. Many forces. All the speed to ease COVID restrictions, all the speed about reopening churches, all this stimulus package for businesses and so on, they are all aimed at returning us to the old normal. You understand? So there are clear tensions between those of us who believe that there ought to be a new normal and those who want to return us to the old normal. You understand? I don't want a new normal in which the vast majority of our people are unemployed. I'm not interested in a new normal in which our resources are still controlled by the multinational corporations. I'm not interested in a new normal where economic policy is dictated from Washington by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. If you're going to have a new normal, it must be that new normal which was envisaged by Osadifo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Sekuturi, America Cabral, and others. It must be a new normal which ensures that our people's access to social services will be expanded. It must be a new normal which ensures that the gold we dig from Ghana is exploited for the benefit of the underprivileged and so on. Clear.
Thanks, Comrade. Perhaps just a last question before we end our very insightful session. There's a comrade who's asking that is a South African Egyptian student at the University of Cape Town here in South Africa. It is known that both of his countries are plagued by neoliberalism and dictatorship. In fact, that's something that we can speak of the rest of the continent. With a lack of a genuine socialist popular student movement, how should we as students then organize ourselves to promote Marxism and the revolution?
It must start with the effort to build a progressive student movement. And that effort need not be anything monumental. You understand? It starts in small groups. In Ghana, we started with small study groups after the 1960 coup, which overthrew the Nkrumah government. And you probably would know that after that imperialist-sponsored coup, it became an offense, a criminal offense, to be seen with a photograph of Nkrumah. It became a criminal offense to be seen with any book on socialism and so on. And many people were arrested simply for possessing Nkrumah's photographs and so on. But the movement went underground, and we built around study groups, and eventually we have emerged, and we are working and so on. In fact, by 1975, the Constitution of the National Union of Ghana Students actually declared the student movement as a Marxist-Leninist organization. And it was a result of work which had been done in the study groups, in the underground movement, and so on. There's not just one formula. There are many formulas, you understand? And it is not possible in this discussion to mention all the different formulas that may be used in order to build revolutionary grassroots organizations. What we have to understand is that we can start small. In fact, in some cases, we have no option than to start small. The Socialist Forum of Ghana, when it first met, had only 4 members. Only 4 members. Today, in the Ghana Institute of Journalism alone, it has more than 100 members in the Ghana Institute of Journalism alone. You understand? So the most important thing is a commitment to build and to develop. And we should not be afraid of making mistakes. You understand? We should not be afraid of making mistakes. We should not be worried about not sounding like Karl Marx or Frederick Engels and so on. You understand? The most important thing is to make a commitment to change society and to explore for the relevant tools, the relevant ideological framework, and so on, and begin. The most important thing is to begin.
Thanks, comrade. Thanks very much for your time. There's just obviously, because this is discussion, some comrades joining in, there is interest as well in terms of getting more questions, but there's just one that I think we shouldn't miss out on an opportunity to get your response on this one. The comrade which said, due to the urgency of this political moment, in your opinion, is it possible to raise revolutionary Pan-Africanism in the absence of solving the issues that you speak of, weakness of labor movement and things like that? He's asking, since these are long-term issues which we can work toward.
You know, my own experience teaches me that in this struggle, long-term, short-term, and medium-term may mean very little. They may mean nothing. Last year, around this time, nobody was expecting COVID-19 to happen. It was not factored into our planning. It was not factored into our mobilization. We woke up one morning, bam, you had COVID-19, exposing the fault lines in capitalism, exposing the weaknesses of African economies and so on. It presents us with a situation, you have to grapple with it, whether you are ready for it or not. So for me, the most important thing is to constantly be working, to constantly be working, trying to know our society, because if you don't know something, you can't change it. You can't change society if you don't know society. So we constantly have to be trying to understand our society, to know our society, to know its weaknesses and so on, constantly be trying to engage with people and so on. As for the hour, I am not so sure that we can predict with any certainty when that moment would occur. I mean, if you read Kwame Nkrumah says very clearly that there comes a moment, you know, in life where the weak is transformed into a powerful force and so on, and you have to grab that moment when it comes, you understand? So it's important to have our plans. It's important to have our plans to decide what we're going to do this year and next year and so on, but we must always realize that that moment may come when we may not consider ourselves ready, and yet we may be compelled, you know, to join the masses in their effort to liberate themselves from the shackles of exploitation and oppression.
Thanks, comrade. On the programmatic question, this is just the one more question, because this, especially on the program, someone was raising the fact that you've raised the question of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, which has a socialist basis. This is absolutely correct. However, you raised the programmatic question as a movement, broad-based solidarity rather than programmatic unity. If a revolutionary Pan-Africanism is to be built, is it not necessary to build a Pan-African revolutionary socialist party which is programmatically united and able to intervene with a revolutionary program in the broad formations you seek to build? The Third International is an example of what is necessary. What is your view?
Well, I think that the two things are not mutually exclusive. We need to build revolutionary socialist organizations. We need to build an international network of revolutionary socialist organizations and so on. At the same time, we need to build broad fronts. The trade union movement is not a revolutionary socialist organization. The women's movement is not a revolutionary socialist organization. The youth and student movement is not a revolutionary socialist organization, and we need to work with them. So we need to work on different fronts. We need to build that revolutionary, programmatic, you know, socialist, revolutionary, Pan-African organization. It's a necessity. That is the movement. That is the organization which would give clarity to the struggle. That is the movement. That is the organization which will become the engine of the struggle. But we need to pull along other progressive organizations which may not necessarily be revolutionary socialists, but which, if you go into the trade union movement, all the workers are there and so on. And we do know that the trade union movement is not necessarily a revolutionary organization. So should we abandon the trade union movement, for example? Should we abandon the women's movement because it is not revolutionary socialist and so on? I don't think so. I think it is possible to work on the two fronts.
Yes. Comrade Kwesi, thank you very much, first of all, for your time and also very rich, insightful information around this particular question as we continue to tackle the problems, not necessarily only imposed by COVID-19, but just by the continuing and enduring the legacy that we're living in of capitalism, imperialism, neo-colonialism. We thank all the comrades who have joined us in the various platforms for taking your time. We know that the conditions imposed on us are not necessarily appealing, and we are using these platforms to actually be able to have the conversation. We hope that this discussion has been rich. It has given you at least some kind of insights going forward in our struggles. And if comrades, there are any further questions, you know that comrades maybe still have burning questions. If you have any further questions that are unanswered, please feel free. You are encouraged to inbox the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party's email at info@srwp.org.za, info@srwp.org.za. With those words, Comrade Kwesi, thank you very much for your time. We're looking forward to having you again in one of these very important themes in future. Thanks very much to everyone, and thanks very much more to you, Comrade Kwesi. Wishing you all the best.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I was hoping to hear a lot more views and disagreements and so on. Didn't happen. Maybe next time it will happen. Look, it's through disagreements and so on that we enrich ourselves, that we learn from ourselves. It's through questioning, things and so on. And we should encourage a lot more of that than having the monologue that we have had today.
No. Let's hopefully next time we'll get more participants as well and more comrades with all kinds of views, such that the discussion is much more richer. Thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Hey, how's Parker?